Hello and welcome to this new addition to our notes. Today we are going to be covering the cell cycle in a bit of a broad sense. We're going to focus on part of the cell cycle today, and we will get into kind of like the second/third part of it in our next set of notes. So diving right into the cell cycle itself, what is it? And basically it's just the life cycle of a cell. So a cell will go through multiple stages in its life, and they're broken into specific parts that have specific goals within each part. The end goal of the cell cycle is for the cell to go from one cell to two identical cells. And that is a key piece, identical, right? We want them to be the same so that they do the same thing. So for today, throughout this lecture, we're really going to focus on interphase, which is this sort of bigger chunk. It's like 70–80% of this circle. And there's a reason for that, because cells spend most of their time in interphase. So getting into interphase, it's busy. The cells are doing a ton of stuff. They're carrying out a ton of metabolic processes. And we'll talk about what happens in each of those G1S and G2 stages. This is also the longest part of the cell. I kind of briefly mentioned that, but cells spend 70–90% of their time just in interphase. That's a huge amount of their life just in one phase of the cell cycle. Now, interphase itself is broken into 3 stages, so let's talk about those. We have G1, right, this kind of purpley color, and that's cell growth. It's exactly what it sounds like. The cell gets bigger. It can't get too big or else it's not very efficient, but it can grow a little bit. In the next phase, we have the S phase, and that stands for synthesis, which means putting together. And in this sense, the genetic material is replicated or copied, so you are making additional copies of the DNA that's already in the original cell. This is super important because, again, that word identical, at the end of this cycle, we want identical cells that have identical copies of DNA. After the DNA replicates, we go into our final stage of interphase, which is the G2 phase, and that's when the cell prepares to divide. But the important part here is that there's a checkpoint, and this is sort of like someone stopping you at the end and saying, are you actually ready to divide? I'm going to double check all of your work and make sure that it's correct. And so at this checkpoint, there's proteins that are involved that check if the DNA replicated properly and if there are enough organelles for 2 new cells. So to make sure that everything that was supposed to happen here actually happens. And then if that all goes to plan, then the cell can actually begin to divide. And the division is called the mitotic phase. It is mitosis. Maybe you've heard of that in previous years, but the mitosis is just this section right here. So it has 4 kind of subphases here, but mitosis in comparison is very short. And in the mitotic phase, the cell nucleus and the duplicated chromosomes divide into those 2 new cells that are going to be formed. So they form 2 daughter nuclei, right? That just means that 2 new cells are formed, again, identical throughout chromosomes and organelles. And then after the mitotic phase, you go through cytokinesis. And cytokinesis is the 3rd and final stage of the cell cycle. Even though it's kind of in this cell division area, it is considered its own separate stage. And cytokinesis is after the mitotic phase, and it's specifically the division of cytoplasm, right? Cyto, cell, kinesis, split. So you're splitting the cytoplasm here. That's why we call it cytokinesis. And so in mitosis, you have the division of nuclei. In cytokinesis, you have the division of cytoplasm. At the end of cytokinesis, you have 2 genetically identical daughter cells with a complete set of chromosomes. I feel like I've said that a lot, and if you think I've said that a lot, that's because it's super important. You absolutely need to have this written down. It is like the most important part of the cell cycle because that is the end goal. Massively important. So what if this cell cycle goes wrong? Well, we just talked about how there's a checkpoint to make sure that everything is replicating appropriately and doing its job exactly how it's supposed to do. But if something goes wrong, your body doesn't always catch it. And what happens is that a tumor can form. And a tumor, by definition, is just a mass of cells. So we're just talking about a bunch of cells that kind of clump together. And this can happen in a multiple of different ways, but typically it's caused by either genetics or environmental factors, right? Like too much sun can cause skin cancer, right? And that can form these massive cells. But one way that your cells can take care of this is what's called apoptosis. And basically, the cell realizes that it's messed up and it's not working properly, and it will just destroy itself. But if it doesn't do that, then it doesn't go through apoptosis, then you can form tumors, right? Masses of cells. And there's two different types of tumors. There's benign tumors, which you do have this abnormal mass, but it's just normal cells. So even though it's not great, it's the better of the two. And then the alternative to that is malignant tumors, and that is an abnormal mass of cancerous cells, and that is when we're really focusing on, okay, the cell cycle went wrong and it has led to cancer. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is something called metastasis, and this is just the spread of cancer cells. So we briefly talked about how, like, if you get too much sun, you can get skin cancer, and typically that starts as like a mole on your skin, and that's your massive tumors, or your massive cells. It's your tumor, and that's where it would start. Well, metastasis is if that primary tumor, wherever it was on your skin, some of those cancer cells are now moving through the rest of your body and going to different areas. It doesn't have to be these 4 areas. It could be anywhere in the body, but when cancer starts to move to a new place in your body, that's called metastasis. Okay, great job. I'll see you guys in class.